Ladies and gentlemen, just before we begin service, just have a couple of announcements for you. After the services here today, interment will take place at Washtenaw Memorial Park on Whitmore Lake Road in Ann Arbor. There's no formal procession. What we'll do is we'll allow ample time for everyone who would like to join us at the cemetery for the prayers. After the burial, Shiva will be through Tuesday evening at the residence of 2794 Colony Road in Ann Arbor. The religious service will be Thursday evening, 5:30, followed up by Saturday through Tuesday at 7 p.m. If you wish to further honor the memory of Mr. Warshai, you may do so by making a donation to the Habanin Doror Camp, Arbor Hospice, or Friends of Ann Arbor District Library. And ladies and gentlemen, the information I went over is the same in your Shiva pamphlets that you have, as well as our funeral home website at hebrewmemorial.org. At this time, I would like you to please silence your cell phones or turn them off.
You say which
Thank
funeral home? Hebrew Memorial.
We begin by my offering on behalf of all of us who are here in the sanctuary and all who are streaming this service throughout the world to express our condolences to the family of Yuval Warshai. Our condolences to Beverly, our condolences to Yasaf and Gal and Yael, and through covenantal partnership to Jennifer and to Eddie, to Yuval's Yuval's sister, Yara, and through covenantal relationship to Sergio. And Yuval was brother-in-law of Jeremy Salinger and Bruce Salinger, and through marriage to Vicky. He's a treasured uncle of 7 and great uncle of 9. We are here to remember him and to love him. We begin traditionally with words of scripture, and the scriptural words I've chosen are from the great philosopher and intellectual of the Tanakh. L'kol zeman, ve'et l'cho chefetz tachat hashamayim, et laledet ve'et lamut, et latat ve'et lakornatua, et laharog ve'et lirpo, et livrot ve'et livnot, et livkot ve'et livschok, et sefod ve'et rekod. There's a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted. There's a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up. There's a time for weeping and a time for laughter, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering them up and putting them on the matzeva at the cemetery, a time for embracing, and a time for boundaries, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for letting go. And there's a time for ripping, and there's a time for sewing up, and a time for silence and a time for speaking. This is one of those times where we start by ripping the ribbon, the garment, to show it's really the sound of the heart ripping, heard directly in heaven. And the rabbis say that following the grief period, that one sews up a torn garment they intend to wear in the future, as a symbol that one's never the same as they were before, because there was a time for ripping, but there's also a time for sewing up and taking steps moving forward. As those who have joined that club know, a time for grief is a time for a lot of difficult silences. And this is a time for speaking. We are not intending the service to cover all of Yuval's expansive spirit and his role in each of our lives, but it's a time for speaking to start a process we hope continues through all of our lives of inviting him into our presence. and speaking words about him and channeling the words that he would have for us. There is no replacing a person of wisdom. There are mines for silver and places where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from rock, but where can wisdom be found? Where is a source of true understanding? There is no replacing a person who possesses that quality. It's from Job. And from memory, what the family just quotes from their minds during sitting with them, Rabbi Tarfon said, God has assigned us a very, very great task, and the workers are lazy, but you may not refrain from the task, even though you will almost certainly not finish it in your lifetime. I'm going to begin a little bit with Yuval's biography. I think I grew a little bit since the last time I was at this. Someone's been practicing for their bar mitzvah. Yuval was, of course, actually I shouldn't say of course, there's controversy about it. Yuval was born in Israel. His mother was born in Poland, and his father grew up in Germany, though his people were from Poland, hence the name Warszawski, Warsaw, and eventually becoming Warshai. They had migrated to Brazil and met in Habonim, and then together made Aliyah, living on the famous kibbutz Givat Brenner. Yuval was born, and his early life was on the kibbutz until his family moved back to Brazil. He returned to Israel for Machon, roughly high school senior year, and after then going back to Brazil and working for 2 years for Habonim and for the Israeli embassy in Brazil, Yuval made Aliyah, eventually settling on kibbutz Gezer. Yuval graduated from Hebrew University, though the kibbutz made him work the entire time, refusing to grant him a work exemption, with hours of agricultural labor before he could go to campus for classes. We can imagine that Yuval was ready for this kind of life, which in many ways shaped him. Half the day with honest work, connected to agriculture, nature, doing it because you know by doing it you're taking care of the people that you love, that the people that you need to take care of for your moral responsibilities, regardless whether the work is unpleasant. And then half the day in intellectual research and engagement. This split in many ways shaped and defined Yuval's life, a soul in some ways split at the core, driven by feeding the soul through his research and uncompromising intellectual engagement, and feeding his spirit through honest work that takes care of those you care about, even if it does not get the respect of society, mixed in with walks in nature. He must have been prepared for the split mandated by the kibbutz because of the ethos instilled in him by Habonim. Those of us who grew up in Habonim know it's instilled in us. In that he found a kindred spirit, albeit expressed in a very different way of walking in this world, in Bev. Both come from Habonim families. It was at Gezer that they met. In 1982, when the Lebanon War started, they ran into each other at the Hadar Ochel for the weekly kibbutz meeting, only to find they were pretty much alone at the meeting, as the meeting had been canceled because of the war. Yuval didn't realize that they had actually met a year earlier, when Bev banged on Yuval's door to tell him and his friends to shut up so others could actually get to sleep. 2 days after meeting at the Hadar Ohel, Yuval was called up on Miluim, being called up to the reserves. Bev took responsibility for taking care of his dog, and she also decided, this will be the soldier I will think about. This will be my lone soldier. So he knows he's not alone. When he returned, they got together, spending all night talking. Another time, they sat together by the fields on a beautiful evening at dusk, watching the sprinklers irrigate the fields, talking about what they wanted out of life. Bev told Yuval that what she most wanted was children, a family of her own. And as Yuval Yuval told her later, at that moment, he silently and privately decided he'd be the one to give that to her. Yuval, in many ways, kept his softer emotions private, as nature herself keeps her emotions private, as if putting our deepest emotions into words diminishes them. His love was spoken for in other ways. Once, when Bev was charged with driving a tractor with her belongings along a dangerous route, Yuval, on his way somewhere else, told her with utter confidence that she could do it no problem. His confidence in me, she says, gave me the confidence to do it. And as someone prone to not call attention to my own worth, Yuval saw more worth in me than I saw in myself. This is the way he showed his love. And this is really the translation of Eshet Chayil, a woman of worth. He sees her worth, displays it to the world. They married and Gal was born. When she was 1.5, the family moved to Ann Arbor, with Yuval starting up his graduate studies at the University of Michigan. While the family expanded gloriously with Yael and Yasaf's arrival, unfortunately, Yuval's academic experience was not quite as glorious. His temperament clashed with the program, and while he completed his master's, he didn't go on for his PhD. And that is something that is not unusual. As someone who has experienced a parallel route, I can tell you that very few people understand that the academic system is not one made for a true intellectual. A true intellectual is one for whom critical thinking and the unyielding search for what is true about this world is not the province of one's field, it's one's religion. It's not someone who takes off that approach to life when they leave their office or their department or their conference, but rather it involves a mind that embraces and comprehends all of life. It is not mastery of a particular field, making moves for advancement, and conversation with a certain set of conversation partners now. It is an eternal conversation. It is, in effect, one's religion. Yuval's mind was comprehending everything, all the time, sifting and filtering what is true about the world, what is not true, what past muster came from hard-fought battles, through his research, through his skepticism, through his self-challenge, and through wide reading. No wonder he was hard to have an argument with. The idea that you could be right with having gone through this process without making this your life's calling, well, you can imagine how he would find that doubtful. Yes, Gal, Yael, and Yasaf grew up with a father like that. Yuval could be unyielding, opinionated, and stubborn in all things intellectual. As Gal put it to me, I learned how to play soccer from him, I learned how to ride a bike from him, I learned Hebrew from him, and especially I learned how to argue from him. And I can tell you that if you didn't yell at him, it didn't sink in. As a true intellectual, Yuval could be brooding, retreating to the comfort of his research and of his beloved classical music, with a special love of the cello's deep, authoritative, emotionally elusive, and complex voice, in many ways mirroring Yuval's voice. As his sister Lara says, his way of being was an unfinished symphony of good and bad mood that was impossible to stay indifferent to, and paradoxically commanded you a certain kind of respect. But Yuval could surprise you. Like the young man immersing his hands in agriculture and watching the sprinklers with Bev, he was always nurturing a softer side, from his beloved walks in nature with his children, the adventures to Mallett's Creek, to his passion for soccer. A good day was a soccer day, to those special emails to his kids, to his out-of-nowhere agreeing ma pitom to bring a stray cat Yael was playing with home and make it the family cat, and to his dutiful letting the cat in and out when the cat wanted, right? You show your love by taking care of those who rely on you. To his out-of-nowhere puns, and, as I'm told, to his very surprising use of emojis. As Gal told me, he had so much in his head. Can you imagine knowing as many languages as Yuval did? And Yasaf puts it this way: he had an incredible memory for information, Things he learned or experienced stayed with him always. It was as if his entire life was laid out on a timeline before his eyes. If you asked him when a major event happened, he could tell you and then proceed onward from there, week by week, month by month. Asking him to recall a family road trip would start with what month we bought the car we drove in 2 years prior and could end up with what happened 6 months after we got back. He would use other memories for reference to build a web of interconnected events. The mind was comprehending it all. This trip happened in June because in May we were still dealing with this other thing that would only be fully resolved that September, which is when Yosef started 3rd grade. Though Yuval was known to be loath to consider himself wrong about anything, making dialogue difficult, in recent years he opened up to hearing about the perspectives of his children. In just one example, Yael made a practice of studying history with him on Saturdays. With Yuval, a simple question about the Soviet Union turned out to require a review of 2,000 years of history since the Roman Empire because, quote, to understand that, you have to understand this. And these questions lit him up. He could go from quiet to suddenly pacing back and forth, just lit up with the passion for this. He certainly did in his final conversation with me, sharing with me some of his research and his perspectives on Maimonides and Spinoza, knowing my background. You have to understand how precise and unconventional Yuval's thinking was. Yuval, like myself, were raised in the study of Jewish intellectual history defined by Gershom Scholem at Hebrew University. For Scholem, ideas were themselves the animating forces of history. And so, for example, the history of Messianism was really about the intellectual transmission and recurrence of those ideas. But Yuval was a realist, and he was a historian. He was not afraid to be a contrarian. His thesis was that it was very concrete socioeconomic factors that produced Messianism in Jewish history, such as with Shabtai Tzvi. As a different person once said, follow the money. Follow people's actual needs. In so many ways, Yuval wedded the Habonim kibbutz farmer who knew what is really real is what people make, what they eat, what they're working for, where the money is coming from, what they hope they can have with the intellectual. His unearthing of a singular document in Portuguese that essentially proved his particular historical hypothesis was a crowning achievement. Often, if not usually, the greatest intellectuals of this world are ones whose achievements are not heralded in their lifetime, and very often not at all. While this never typically occurs to the rest of the world, Yuval knew that. Yuval was passionate about Maimonides' writings on the soul, and I do not pretend to represent his views on them, but I can tell you that Rambam does not view the soul as that kind of object that floats around in a mystical framework. For Rambam, the soul, and to understand this, you really have to understand Aristotle, but I won't go into it now, is really an active faculty of existence that operates in two parts. One part of it is called the animal soul, also sometimes called the emotional soul, meaning it's the faculty we use in our existence that we share with the animals. We love our children, which is why we don't eat meat and milk together, because the animals do too. We operate to care for them and to make them feel safe. We are moody because, like the animals, we are sensitive in each moment, and everything around us affects us. And the other part of the soul is the rational faculty, and it is something we do not share with the other animals. It's our faculty, it's a gift from God, it's what makes us in the image of God. It's our faculty of seizing the world with our minds, of capturing its underlying connections, of understanding causality through time, and how one thing leads to another. It's the real Torah, the Torah that the rabbis were talking about when they referred to it as the underlying structure of the universe. And for Maimonides, the real prophet is the intellectual, the philosopher, for they embrace relating to God and to the world with their rational soul. In an exchange with Yael, Yuval wrote it this way, quote, "Philosophy can be thought of as the human act of thinking, relating things to one another, what Foucault once called the ordering of things, and understanding. You describe the joy of getting new understandings of things from your reading. I am glad to hear you are getting this from your studies. since I think this is really one of the most important goals of learning. That is, to get intellectual satisfaction from what you read. I believe that when you get that, that is really when you learn and understand any subject. If you can apply that to what you do, that is the fundament of living a happy life. And I do hope you all can attain that. And as I said, for Rambam, the philosopher is also the prophet, because understanding a world rationally means understanding it morally. True reason is not merely scientific. At its apex, it is the manifestation of moral, rational reason. Intellectual conscience and moral conscience are two sides of the very same coin. As Yasaf wrote, when I asked about his army service after making Aliyah, he chuckled and said how proud he was to have been a terrible soldier. When the Lebanon War broke out, he was a founding member of Yesh Gavul, an organization of soldiers who refused to go into Lebanon on moral principle. I'm inspired by his rejection of orders that he saw as unjust or incompatible with his worldview, and I strive to be as terrible a soldier as he was. Yuval was the very combination of the two parts of the soul, the uncompromising, rigorous, nonconformist, realist, pensive, complicated intellectual, lighting up when his rational soul was engaged. And also the emotional soul, the one that sits at dusk watching the sprinklers and makes a silent oath to pair and to make a family with their partner perched next to them. The one who makes his children feel safe and cared for, even doing work beneath them to make it happen. The one who puts his confidence in his wife and knows her true worth is Eshet Chayil. I think Yuval was most proud of his intellectual conscience in his research and of his family. Sitting with his family and hearing about their lives, I knew what I had to conclude this eulogy with, which is a dear poem from Yehuda Amichai. I won't do it in Hebrew because I don't have it memorized, but I have the English memorized, and it goes like this. Like a ship's captain who very, very important dinner guests at the captain's table ask to go down to see the machinery in the bowels of the ship. So I take my guests to the bedroom of my 3 children. I open up the door and I invite them to look. And instead of the sound of the giant machinery going up and down like the foundation of the firmament, they hear the sounds of my 3 children breathing up and down, bathed in a blue light that goes out toward infinity. But I can't finish with that poem because I conclude this eulogy with a poem that Yuval himself wrote. I have 3 children. My middle daughter now lives on the western shining sea of this big land, on the coast of the Pacific Ocean. My youngest son lives now on the eastern shining sea, on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. Yael and Yasaf are now as far apart as east can be from west, as far apart as sea can be from shining sea, or as the Hebrew expression goes, Kerochok Mizrach Mema'arav. They are both far, far away from their parents, as far away from us in this big land as they can be. My oldest daughter, in contrast, is as close to her parents as she can be. She lives with us under the same roof. We are still here in the middle, more or less, in southeast Michigan, in the so-called Midwest, that really is more of a Mideast, not to confuse it with the Middle East, where all 3 of them grew up. At night, before I go to sleep, when I think of them laying on my bed, and wish all of them a very long and happy life. My head's GPS position is exactly as Gal's head's GPS position, very close to the southwest corner of our house, only my bed 2 floors above hers, but on that same southwest corner of the house and facing the same direction. Yael then is at my head in Portland, as far in the land as she can be, and Yasaf is then at my feet in Brooklyn, New York, also as far in the land as he can be. And I again just lay there at night before I go to sleep, and I wish for them, in order from the oldest to the youngest, the longest and happiest life that they may have. And Yael replied to that email, and I think she speaks for all of us, who knew our father was such a poet. Actually, I knew. I knew because I've watched you all my life, sitting and reading about the history of the world, sitting and thinking about the world in your chair in the living room. You are a thinker, you are an observer. Anyone who takes time to think, to slow down, to understand the past, to observe the world like that, is truly a poet. I'm speaking for all of us, she writes. Thanks for sharing your inner poetry with us, Abba. It means a lot to me. Yuval loved the sound of the cello. There's something in the sound of the classical instrument that brings a quality of voice into the world. The family, we've invited Rachel to play, and it's not about the choice of this particular composition per se, but rather the family is asked to communicate to you, let's invite in the sound of this instrument. Think of it as inviting in the sound of Yuval's voice. And as the wordless instrument plays, may each of us hear Yuval's voice speaking to us individually. Please rise. Exalted, compassionate God, grant an infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure. To the soul of Yuval Warshai, Yuval ben Akim V'Tamar, who is returning to his eternal home in you. Merciful One, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace, and may his soul continue to be bound up in the bonds of those living in this world, and joining those who are living in the world that is to come. May he find peace, and let us say, Amen. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen B'Hameromim, Hamse Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, B'Ma'alot Kedoshim, Utehorim, Kezohar Harakia, Mazirim, Nishmat Yuval ben Akim, V'Tamar shehalach le'olamo, Began Eden, Tehei menuchato, Ana Baal Harachamim, Hasdirehu b'seter knafecha le'olamim, Utzror bitzor hachayim, Et nishmato, Adonai hu nachlato, Yanuach b'shalom, Al mishkavo, V'nomar, Amen. We remain standing. I invite up Wayne at this time. Those who are proceeding to the burial will continue directly to Washnong, and those who are joining us later for Shiva will be gathering at the house at 5:30 p.m.